I'm Andrea, a passionate DEI advocate and consultant on a mission. Join me in each episode as we celebrate diversity, ignite conversations, and craft workplaces and educational institutions where everyone thrives. This podcast is my commitment to making a meaningful impact on the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So are you ready? Let's get Diversifused. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Get Diversifuse podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Horton-Mericli, founder of Diversifuse DEI Consulting and a passionate DEI advocate and ally. In today's episode, we will discuss unlocking innovation, embracing gender diversity, inclusive practices for a welcoming workplace with our guest speaker, Natalie Jovanic. Natalie specializes in working with diverse clients who have experienced trauma and loss. They are passionate about supporting their clients in regaining control of their lives. They believe that healing is possible. The services are trauma-informed and based on anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices. Natalie has an integrative approach to trauma counseling that includes eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, if you are familiar with that term, as well as anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices. Additionally, they provide workshops, mentoring, and consultancy services for leaders around power, privilege, and anti-oppressive practices. So welcome, Natalie, to the Get Diversifuse podcast. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you, Andrea, for having me. I'm very happy to be here and also to share a bit around my experience and my lived experience, and I hope people can learn and grow from it and gain
Awesome.
a couple of insights.
I hope so too. That's one of the reasons I have this podcast, so people can learn different things around DEI. So why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, your experiences, and how you came to be a trauma counselor?
Okay, I had a real kind of complex childhood. I grew up with childhood abuse. And so I didn't become a counselor until after I had finished my own healing journey, because I was, as many people, skeptical about counseling. Mm-hmm. And I think my own healing journey also taught me very well what is a healthy trauma counselor and what is not a healthy trauma counselor. And unfortunately, it is a really complex field to navigate, and some modalities just don't work. And so one thing is I'm a survivor of childhood abuse. The other thing is I'm bicultural in my culture of origin. And I always had a kind of sense of systemic thinking, and I had a good sense around power and privilege, how it showed up in conversations. Like, for example, in my first career, I'm an engineer. And so I worked in my practicum, I worked on the factory floor. And I noticed how differently the workers spoke about the engineers, and I noticed the gap between and the prejudices that existed, and that people weren't collaborating, but it was more about status and class. And so when I talked to the workers, I really also noticed how hurt they felt if they weren't considered and if their voice was just dismissed. And so I think because of my family, my father has Croatian background, my mother had German background, since my parents necessarily never talk to each other, so I didn't really see them together. But just after, when I did my own healing, I noticed that yes, my mother was discriminative towards him and also looked down on him for being different. And so I think in my healing, I tried to make sense out of the different dynamics. And so when I was in Spain, I was trained in systemic modalities to heal trauma. And they always considered the individual in their context, and they also considered the power dynamics from the outside resources, like how do mental health institutions look at people. And so it was a very much an approach that was systemic and focusing on how can we use power healthily. So I then moved to Canada. I became a counselor and I did the training, and I noticed that the systemic aspect was so much excluded. And I started working in workplaces, and I noticed that anti-oppressive practice and power and privilege was the aspect that was excluded. And on the other hand, in a systemic perspective, everything that is excluded will persist in the system. So I think this is when I started I'm aware that in many different narratives around DEI, they don't talk a lot about power and privilege. However, if we don't include it in our work, it will not necessarily change. And we will kind of continue the cycle of oppression. And just because as a child, because I had experienced violence, for me, a lot of my motivation is how I can break the cycle of violence, whether it's individually or systemically. And this led me to integrating anti-oppressive, anti-racist practices. On the other hand, I need to say, yes, I'm a non-binary immigrant, so I have my own experience of oppression, which taught me a lot around what I hope people would do if they have privilege. So a lot of the practice I do around white privilege stem from my own experience of oppression. So it's really interconnected for me.
Fascinating, fascinating. Wow. You've gone through a lot and survived. As you said, you're a survivor, which and I love that you said that you did not become a counselor until you finished your own healing journey. And that is very important for you to say, because you went through your own healing journey and survived, and you can relate to others who are going through or have gone through and trying to work through their own journey of survival better than someone who has not experienced
and
types of trauma.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I have felt how stigma feels like. So I know it. And so if I work with my clients, one of my thing is like, how can I make sure that they don't feel stigmatized by me? And because I'm in a position of power, so how do I navigate the power differential and how do I create trust? So in a way, to some degree, I also self-disclose. I don't give details. Like I wrote a book about my story so people could read it, but like in a client session, if I work with somebody who, for example, has experienced sexual abuse and I notice there's something going on, I just ask them whether it would be helpful for them if I self-disclose, and they say yes. And then I may just acknowledge, yes, I had an experience of sexual abuse. So I can relate to the stigma and these kind of things. And I think it is helpful for people to know that they're not alone. And I know that in counseling, it's not about self-disclosure, but it's just in those moments when there is a power differential, I usually check in whether it would be helpful. And if they say yes, I give them the theme.
That is just wonderful. And because you don't want them to think that, oh, it's about me, not about you. Because if you don't ask for permission, it could come across that way if you self-disclose without asking. And so that is very important to ask before. Yeah, I'm actually, I would love to be a fly on the wall in one of your counseling sessions just to see how you work, because it sounds very interesting. It's very important work. And as you said, DEI initiatives across organizations, which are workplaces or educational institutions, need to acknowledge, as you had said, the power and the privilege of all individuals. We all have specific sections of privilege and power in our different identities. No matter if you're BIPOC or identify with the LGBTQ plus community or if you're a cisgender white man, Christian white man. It's we all have different types of privilege, and so it's very important, as you had said, to acknowledge that when you're creating DEI initiatives, but also it's important for people themselves, the individuals, whether they're employees in a workplace or students in a classroom or community at large, to recognize that in themselves as well. There's parts of our identities that we do struggle with, that do get stereotyped, that do get ignored or talked over in some situations. But there's others where we do have a platform of status or privilege that we can use to help others who may be in that situation where we have privilege and power. We can use our privilege and power to help others, raise them up and let their voices be heard and their concerns be heard as well. So
Yes, and like when I speak about like in the area where I have white privilege, I still like my voice will be heard better than the voice of a Black person, for example. My voice, and I also will have less negative repercussions than a Black person or an Indigenous person or a person of color. So this is a bit where it really comes to power. Like I'm unlikely to be fired in an organization if I speak up. And for a Black person, there is a risk.
Yeah, because there's that stereotype, like, oh, they're just being difficult.
Yeah,
they're not listening. They're not wanting to be flexible. They don't fit in. And whereas someone who does on the outside fit the mold of the norm, as you said, they don't often come across those same stereotypes and stigmas that others might. And but it goes the same in the reverse situation. Say you're a teacher, a white teacher, a white female teacher, or we'll say white male teacher in a high school that is in a neighborhood that's predominantly Black and Latinx. You are the minority, and so other teachers and colleagues who do fit in with the norm in that neighborhood on the outside can use their voice to help those that don't be heard, and also wonderful. So thank you for sharing your journey and what inspired you to specialize in trauma-informed and anti-oppressive practices. So actually, I have a question. Why did you go to Spain to do training?
Okay, first of all, I always wanted to leave Germany. So the first country I moved to was Spain. I moved to Spain because just of the culture, like Spanish culture is very beautiful and it was very supportive for healing. So I didn't go there for training. I really lived in Spain. And so I was an immigrant in Spain. And then from Spain, I moved to Canada.
Nice. Okay, cool. Nice. And so you were the minority in Spain in certain aspects, even though you're very fair. A lot of Spaniards are fair, but you were an immigrant.
Well, I'm also a minority in Germany because my last name isn't German. So my mother tongue is German. My mother is German. My last name is Croatian. So just what people project onto me, they may just assume that I'm not German. And I noticed after I moved, in general, Germans don't recognize me as German anymore after I lived abroad, just because my name doesn't fit into the cultural norms of being German. In Spain, honestly, because Spain is more relationship driven, I felt less of these experiences. Like in Germany, it was more this kind of weird that people said to me, you speak well German for being a foreigner. And I was just like, why do you talk? It was just these kind of things where I said, okay, like, not sure what to tell you. In Spain, it was far more easy to integrate because I think it is a far more relationship-based culture, far more like it's about connection, it's about relationships. So it was far easier for me in Spain, and Canada for me was a huge cultural shock. Like I came here because of diversity and inclusion, and then I noticed that it's quite performative and it's not necessarily lived everywhere. So this was a really hard awareness process for me to find out, okay, and also find out where do I fit in there. And then being non-binary didn't make it easier either. So there were many things it was a really growth journey for me to be myself and be in the culture. I learned to speak up, and I also learned to speak up in a very gentle way. I think 10 years ago, I wouldn't have done that. But like cultures change us. And I think sometimes it's really the thing, okay, even a challenging situation, what can I learn from it?
Awesome. Yeah, I love that, because everybody, even if it's not with different countries, everybody faces challenging situations. So it's good to see what you can learn from that situation and how you can grow. Maybe you did some things wrong in that certain situation. You assess, what can I do differently to in the next time if it happens again. So that's awesome. So let's move on to our next question. So how can workplaces create a more inclusive environment for gender diverse individuals?
So I would say the starting point is really to do an assessment. Where are you at? and then also to focus on continuous growth and learning. So the first step for me would be like really to see where are they at gender diversity? What is the language they are using? Are they using gendered language that is only focusing on men and women? Or are they using more inclusive language like folks, teams, and stuff like that? I also think in their inner picture, like if they make their decisions, do they consider gender diverse people? Is it really about men or women? So I think, and the other step is really starting to educating. And I think if you have a better awareness how an inclusive culture may look like, it's easier to assess where you're at as an organization. The other thing, what I think is really also the areas where they have unconscious biases. It is natural, we all have them, but like, how likely will a person be hired if they use they, them pronouns? Or how likely will a person be hired if they are visible transgender? And if they are not passing as cis. So really looking at these kind of things is useful. I think the other thing is really also looking at their processes, if they support gender diversity. Do they have pronoun policies? Do they maybe have packages for people who choose to medically transition? And do they also have processes in place to support a person who comes out as gender diverse or trans?
That is awesome. And as you said, like just like with DEI consultants, it usually starts with assessing the situation, the organization. So that makes sense that you said that it starts with an assessment. Looking at the overall picture and then going, from large to small. And I also loved that you included the medical insurance type a component, because a lot of people don't think about that. And with, at least in the United States, with certain states and the government initiatives and stuff in certain states, there are restrictions for in place that organizations don't really have to follow if they are headquartered in another state and things like that. So it's things to think about, and definitely make sure to include in your assessments when you are looking at your DEI initiatives and inclusion initiatives and your trauma-informed initiatives, to make sure that you create as inclusive of a space of belonging and acceptance and accessibility as possible. So,
in the current context, what I think might also be used is to really acknowledge that with all the changes in the world, like the world for queer or trans folks is getting much more difficult and the barriers are higher. Like just if I think about international travel, as a trans person, it's sometimes not so easy to travel internationally. And so if you are an international organization, there might be things where you need to think about how can you support people in that?
I never even thought about that. Oh my gosh, that is a great point. And you're 100% correct. Like, especially if the employees have to, it's not a direct flight. They have to go, a few stops in between, because they have to check in those countries, and it could pose some problems and issues. So those are definitely things to think about.
Some countries will not allow trans folks to even go into transit. So they are not allowed to fly there.
Oh my goodness.
So if a person, for example, has a passport which has the gender X on them, right now there are about 27 countries that acknowledge this passport.
Only 27?
Yes. So if a person, for example, were a trans woman who is passing, maybe they can go through, but like the airport screeners check your body whether it fits into the male female thing. So there is a potential risk. And so this is a bit like, yes, there comes legal kind of things that I know people like cis people aren't aware of because they don't need to live through it.
Yeah. Wow. So there's only 27 countries that acknowledge that passport.
As far as I know, yes, like it can change, but like right now it's 27. And like the others may leave you through. And then there are some countries who don't allow trans folks in.
Wow. So the travel needs to be coordinated appropriately by looking at that list as well. That's very interesting to know. So yeah, I did not know that. So thank you for bringing that to not just my attention, but to the listeners' attention. And it's, as you said, if and it's with everything. If it doesn't pertain to you, don't always think, you don't always know about it. And
Yes.
but it's good to be open to learning stuff. And yeah, awesome. So you already touched a little bit on this, but what are some other common challenges gender diverse folks face in the workplace, and how can leaders address these challenges? Leaders and colleagues.
Okay. So I think one of them is being a token hire. So if you just hire a trans person because you want to be diverse and so on, but you're not willing to put in the effort. And so I think, at least in my experience, what happened to me, like I tend to speak up if I don't feel respected, but then my voice is constantly dismissed. Or I hear a lot of excuses why the change can't happen. And like, I'm not expecting that change happens, but I'm expecting at least the acknowledgement that there is a point, and maybe kind of thing like, maybe can we work on a plan on how we could get there? I think the other thing is, and my lived experience is being non-binary and immigrant. So what can happen is that the expertise of the gender diverse person is completely dismissed because the other person doesn't see it as valuable. And I would say there is a bias in who is better and who is less. So really, like, these kind of things show up in the workplace. And to some degree, I would prefer not to have them, but I'm also okay. I know that they might happen. So I think if we would take this as an opportunity to dismantle the biases and to start a meaningful conversation about it, I would see it as a beautiful moment of connection. And I also know it's often for cis people hard to have these conversations. So they easily dismiss them or disappear or just stop talking. And this doesn't make my life easier. So I think if you don't want to have a token hire person, really put in the effort and think about how you can improve, how you can learn from them, how you can experience the obstacles the person is facing in your company, because be aware, it is very likely, depending on the size of your company, and if it's not a queer-led company, that transphobia will be in the workplace. So it's likely one of your employee may have transphobia. So the question is, how do you support the employee you're having to navigate these situations? And then on a maybe, like if a person is constantly misgendered, please take care that people know pronouns policies. Like I've worked in an organization and they had a pronoun policy. So everyone put their pronouns in the signatures and I put mine. It didn't work at all. Like I think nobody read the signatures. So I was constantly like, as ladies and as like this. So I learned I really learned to say when I got to know somebody new, and please note, this is who I am. Please don't do this, but be aware, even if you have things like pronouns in signatures or pronouns in voice calls, put in effort to use them, like, and think about it and look at it. And like, for me, I needed to learn it too, but it's a habit. Like I look at the pronouns people have in their signatures so that I use the right ones.
Yeah, I try to too. And people make mistakes all the time. Like they mess up, every now and then, but it's knowing that you messed up. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I used she instead of they or them. But in my experience, as long as you put forth the effort and are trying, and you are aware of, if you make a faux pas, and you don't always have to apologize for it, but it's like you're aware that you make a faux pas. That's what's important. And, making the effort. And because the more you make the effort, the easier it's going to come to you, and then it's going to become more natural. And
I agree. I think it feels differently internally if somebody puts the effort or if they don't. I also think sometimes be aware, like, for example, in one organization that was more queer focused, they had a supplier. So I asked, who didn't use pronouns. So I asked them, and they were from other cultural backgrounds. And I'm aware that not all cultures are as queer inclusive as others. So I asked my supervisor, like, do you know anything about their pronoun policies? Like, because I also don't want to impose my culture on people who believe that my identity is against their laws. Like it is a complicated thing, but if you have diverse workplaces, we may have these tensions.
I agree. And also global workplaces, you may have tensions as well, like different, offices in different countries. So that is very important for leaders to think about, and across the globe, especially if you're global, because you'll need to be more cognizant of like what types of trainings people need to get and be exposed to. So yeah, I know. A few years ago, I had a non-binary colleague. They came out, and I didn't originally know them as non-binary. I originally knew them as she, her, and it was a struggle for me. I often put my foot in my mouth. It's like, it was my very first experience with they, them, and in my mind, it was grammatically incorrect, coming from like the old school. But as I said, I kept putting the effort and was cognizant. And my colleague, my friend, was so understanding, and they would remind me, and some of my other colleagues would remind me too when I would mess up. And it's like, oh my gosh, thank you. I didn't realize I said that. So, and then I would correct myself. And it's just to be, aware. And it's sort of like when I love it when workplaces have the pronoun policy, because many people get on board. Hopefully everybody gets on board, but many people get on board, but they help each other and remind each other when they do make a mistake. And it's when you have inclusive teams like that, it's a great thing to have that, because people are teaching each other and leaning on each other for support. And so I love inclusive workplaces. And so go ahead.
Like maybe also one thing from my own experience when I work with cis clients on their cis privilege, I think sometimes it's also about being really honest. Like one of my clients once said to me, she thinks she still project onto me that I'm a woman because it's just not her lived experience.
Yeah.
And she felt really uncomfortable to say this, but for me, it was a sense of relief because it was honest. And then we could start talking about it. And to some degree, I need to say, I don't fully understand the experience of a cis woman or a cis man. For me, this is learnings. It's not my lived experience. And in the past, I used to project onto cis people that they experience gender as I do, which doesn't work. But like, I think we need to lean into this vulnerability also, and to create this deeper sense of connection. And I still believe like honesty is useful, even if it's uncomfortable.
I agree. And having those conversations, because not everybody's going to be exposed to the same experiences and situations. So if you have a new employee, maybe they never had worked in a workplace that had pronouns and was as inclusive as that organization is. So it's going to be new to them. It may be new to them, I should say. And so having those, supporting each other and leaning on each other, it's just so good. I love it. And I'm hoping more of our organizations across the globe go that way, because it's very important, because everybody has intersectional identities. Every person is more than what they look like on the outside.
Yes. And I, like in my business, I work towards inclusion, and I am aware how complicated it is if I just look at all the existing intersectionalities. Like one of the principles is look at the most oppressed intersectionality you can have, and how accessible are your services for them. And like there are limitations. Like I still think like in Canada, I would say a trans indigenous woman with disability is probably one of the most oppressed intersections you can have here. But then if I look at ableism, there are areas where I can provide accessibilities, and there are areas where really right now I can't in my business, and like working towards them, but also sometimes being honest, what right now isn't possible. But like, and if you look at the wheel of intersectionalities, like it is a big wheel.
It is. And there's new things getting added almost every day. And I love that you gave the Canadian most vulnerable for the United States. It's similar, like either Native American or Black, more so Black male. Actually, no, I would say Black female. It depends on the situation. It could be Black male or female, disabled, by LGBTQ, who identifies as LGBTQ plus, neurodiverse, and so that they would be probably the most vulnerable. Depending on the situation, it could be a Black male or a Black female, and yeah. So it's, but I love that you gave the suggestion of looking at yourself, of all your identities, of all your intersectional identities, and looking for the most vulnerable, and looking at all the barriers that identity faces, and then working from there. I love that. That's like, a great strategy.
Like for an organization, it could be for services, but it could also be internally as an employee.
I agree. So how do trauma-informed practices support the healing and empowerment of gender diverse individuals?
Okay, so I just do trauma-informed practices is a little bit different than trauma therapy. So trauma-informed practices ideally would be done by all counselors, whether they are grief counselors or counselors for anxiety. Trauma-informed practices moves away from there's something wrong with you into what has happened to you, and it prioritizes safety, mutuality, collaboration. And it also prioritizes cultural awareness, historical awareness, and gender awareness. So for me, how I translate it is into really actively on how can I break the cycle of oppression? And if I work with my client, how can I not repeat this in the client relationship? And so even though I'm non-binary, towards certain identities in the gender diverse community, I have privilege towards them. Like I have privilege, I pass in the C train. A trans woman who is visibly trans doesn't pass in the C train. So I have a lot of privilege towards her. And so for me, it's even that I pay attention to it. And so I integrate trauma-informed practices, and then I'm a trauma therapist, which means I have additional specialized training on how to resolve trauma and how to work with trauma, because it's often really complex. And so in this way, when I look at my own community, I think that trauma therapy, if it's done by somebody who understands their privilege and their power and their cultural connection to the individual, it really can support us to heal from systemic violence. And it can also help us to find an empowered place to really navigate an oppressive society, and also to resist our experience of oppression, because no matter how much healing somebody does, we cannot change the dominant group. Like the dominant group would need to do their work to transform oppression, but we can try to find this place for us where we feel fulfilled and healthy in ourselves. And this for me includes things like having healthy boundaries, choosing self-preservation and standing up for ourselves, maybe sometimes choosing silence as an empowering way of resistance instead of standing up, because if you are in a workplace where you're dismissed constantly, it is useless at one stage to start talking. So then it's really like, how can we find a way to empower the client in that? And even with my clients, if they have she, her pronouns, it's easier. But if they use they, them pronouns, I sometimes have the conversation, do you put them on the resume or not? Because you're more likely to be hired if you don't put it on the resume. Because if people don't know, they see you as project gender onto you. And so these kind of conversations on, it's difficult to navigate, like how to still be yourself, but also be aware that you sometimes maybe choose to lower your boundary just to empower yourself. And the other element where I use EMDR, where I use parts work and different approaches, is really to heal the pain of the systemic violence so that you can find more freedom in the present moment. It doesn't mean that it will go away, but if you relate to it differently, there is more freedom for you. Does this make sense?
Wow. Yeah, it does. It does. And actually, to have it make sense for some of our listeners who may be struggling with it, think of your own trauma. And if you had never experienced any trauma that, like sexual trauma or discrimination or anything like that, think of someone you loved and cared about that was very close to you, that passed away. all of a sudden, or just passed away. And that's traumatic if it was someone you were very close to. And so you can look at it through that lens, because there's similar healing processes that you need to go through, especially if it was a very, very close loved one. And so you can look at relating to what Natalie's saying through that lens. And
yes, and maybe, I don't know whether that's helpful. Like for myself, a little bit where I see the difference when I healed my childhood trauma, like I can cut ties with my family of origin if they continue to be toxic, and I don't have connections with them because they never did their own healing. However, gender diverse people and other people who are targeted by systemic oppression, they can't escape their experience of oppression. So I can only find different ways to relate with it. And so this is a bit like we need to navigate this in the tension of the system. And I really think we can do a lot of healing in our own emotions, and also a lot around acknowledging it, but not allowing it to overtake us. If this makes sense.
So, yeah, I mean, it's because it's always going to be with you. It's part of your past. You experienced it. You lived through it. You survived it, and you're through your help. Your clients are learning how to say, "I am a survivor." And yes, it's something I lived through, but it's not who I am. This is who I am. This is, and, I'm this, and they're not going to let your people who experience trauma and survive learn to not let it run their lives, the trauma. And
okay, yes, like when it comes to trauma, I think we can really integrate it and we can thrive no matter what happened to us. When it comes to systemic oppression, is about learning to be with it and gain emotional freedom, which is more complicated because it may still go on sometimes in the present moment. Like if you come into a new workplace that doesn't live for DEI, or like I would say, at least with the clients I work with and for myself, like when the anti-trans movement started a couple of years ago, it hit us by surprise. We didn't expect it. And I really also needed to think for myself, how can I empower myself in that? And how can I still be myself in that and take a stand? And so this is a bit like, it's sometimes really like, how do I navigate things that are out of my control and still find a place of empowerment?
Got you. Okay. Wow. I mean, this is such a complex topic, as you had said before we started the recording, but it is so important. There's so many bits and pieces that need to be thought about and addressed, but it is very important for organizations to acknowledge these types of initiatives, that they should be incorporating in their policies and procedures and practices and supportive services for their employees. Whether it's an employee assistance program that has counseling and therapy, financial assistance programs, mentorship, whatever it may be. And, or also, giving payment early as if they need to pay for certain things that are unexpected. Oh my gosh, there's so many aspects of trauma that just need to be thought about. And your work is just so important. And I hope that your field is a growing field, because it's a needed field. There are so many people in this world that have experienced trauma, whether they're refugees or victims of violence, trafficking, whatever it may be. And there's just so many different components that can cause someone to experience trauma. And
yes,
it's
it's
more prevalent than people think.
Okay, like the definition, like our knowledge around trauma is constantly evolving. So the current best practice definition is that trauma is an experience that overwhelmed our capacity to cope with it. And so it is a really individual experience. And I think some people are not even aware that it's not necessarily about the big event of sexual abuse. It can be a toxic relationship. It can also be bullying in the workplace. It is just like any kind of experience that overwhelms the capacity of an individual to deal with it. And like, especially when it comes to workplaces, like the one layer that comes to it is the financial pressure. Like, what if like people stay in situations that may not be good for them because they need to earn them a living? And so there are like, there's a lot of pressure. So it is really looking individually, and many people come to me wouldn't say that they have experienced trauma, but when I explain it to them, when I explain to them the different symptoms, they kind of see the connection. And then I also explain like some of the symptoms we are having. We are having them because they're an adaptive coping skill to deal with it. So it doesn't mean there's something wrong with the individual. It's really the response from our nervous system to navigate something that was overwhelming.
Oh, wow. That just makes it a lot more, that definition you gave and the examples you gave just made it a lot more real and relatable for so many of these of my listeners right now. And it's because most people, if not all people, have experienced something that overwhelmed them, that they just did not know what to do. And it was to the point of almost a breakdown, or just high stress. And I mean, that's trauma. And staying in a situation like you had said, whether it's I had to stay in this job where I'm treated like not treated well because I need to pay my bills. I have children, I don't want to be out on the street, or an abusive relationship, like you had said, domestic violence of some sort. They stay because similar things. They don't know what other options they have, and it's there's just so many types of events that could cause trauma that organizations, leaders need to be aware of and include in these initiatives in their practices. And I'm going to keep saying that because it's important for them to do this. So with that, what advice do you have for leaders who want to incorporate anti-oppressive practices into their leadership style, and not just the leadership style, but also try to get it into the policies and procedures of the organization?
And I think the first step is what I say is start with yourself. So it's about critical self-reflection, leaning into discomfort, educating oneself, and really understanding one's intersectionality and one's privileges, and understanding the experiences of other diverse group you're not a member of. So really trying to see everyone who's talking to you as a voice of, if it's Canada, ask of Canada, US, of the States, and see them as somebody who represents the system you're part of, and just try to expand your view on the system. And then really reflect on yourself. What does it tell about you, about the privileges you have? What are the experiences you never had? I also really sit down with yourself. What is your relationship with power? Because many people who have experienced abuse of power kind of tend to deny it, and then they tend to deny privilege. However, having power in itself is neither right or wrong. But the thing is, how do you use the power you have? So really sit down and think about what is your relationship with power, and work towards having a healthy relationship with it. Because the more you're aware of it, the more also you can handle diversity in this context.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And the other thing is, like, do a critical assessment and reflection on the organization, and think about how would a diverse employee experiences, how would a user or somebody who buys your services, if you have services, experience it. And so one of the really important principles of anti-oppressive practices is believe the individual from the oppressed group and reflect on your privilege. And I know this is sometimes the hard part, like, because the person may tell you something that is really hard to hear for you, because you experience your culture based on your privilege. And then the individual comes and tells you something really dark and ugly. And then it's like, oh, but it's not me. Like, oh, it's not us. Like, and so be aware, if you do this, it's probably a protective part of you taking over. So try to learn, take care of those parts that want to deflect it, deny it, or get defensive, nurture them, but still what they believe the individual who shared it. And so really then for yourself, explore all the privileges you're having, and then really think about how does it integrate into your leadership style? For example, how might a trans woman feel in front of you? How might a non-binary person feel in front of you? And really try to get this, if you can, and if you're prepared enough, create relationships with people who are different to you. I have a sense, at least in Canada, we relate on the level of privilege we have. Yeah. And so if you have a lot of privilege, you tend to only relate with people with a lot of privilege. So what might happen if you relate to somebody with far less and be curious and learn about their experience as also a growth moment for yourself? And then like one thing about anti-oppressive practice, it's really a continuous journey. And also the more you get aware, the more you see it, the more you might notice people around you who don't have healthy behaviors. So really find like-minded people who can support you on the journey, because it can be sometimes a really lonely journey. Like I know that I would hope the counseling field were farther ahead in it. We are really not even beginning. Like really be aware it is a change process and you will be a change maker in it. And so you need to find some support if there is a lot of resistance to change.
And there will be resistance. There's always resistance. So,
and one other thing is you can look at. So I know that the term is scary, but like try to work towards understanding the traits of the culture of white supremacy. And I need to say, like the ones which mostly prevent healthy engagement in anti-oppressive practices for me is power hoarding, fear of conflict, defensiveness, perfectionism, denial, or right of comfort. And so it is important that everyone looks at themselves like, how does this show up within myself? And how can I grow as a human being so that I can practice the antidotes?
I love that. Oh, wow. Do you have any suggestions for self-assessment resources that leaders can do that might be free or low cost?
I think one free thing is Tema Okun has a page which is called Culture of White Supremacy, and she has a workbook which is called White Supremacy Culture Still Here. So the workbook really explains all the different traits of white supremacy in the context of organizations and also certain antidotes. So, and it is free. So if people want to look at that, that would be great. And really, I think I have another resource. I can send it to you afterwards if you want to.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love that. So listeners, I will be putting the, was it Anitma Okun, you said?
Tema Okun, I think, yes.
Oh, Tema Okun, sorry. I misheard that.
Yes, I send it to you and you can put it up there.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'll be putting in the description of our podcast today. So, and on the last slide. So I will get those resources from you. So, because I'd like to give some resources for our listeners to look at and review at the end of every podcast, so they can, it's like their call to action. So,
yeah.
And so I like to provide some stuff. So thank you so much. And yeah, I also love that you had said, not just the self-assessment, but finding your support network, because it is going to be challenging and uncomfortable, and anything that's challenging and uncomfortable, and when we feel alone in something, we tend to talk ourselves out of doing it. We start making excuses and stuff. So we need almost like an exercise buddy. So yes. Yeah, we need our support group. So try to find like-minded individuals who are doing that also. Like if you have a colleague, another leader, another manager, another board member who is like, yeah, let's do this, support each other in it, because you will face skepticism, you'll face resistance, you may face some backlash, but it all starts with that. In any progress starts with that baby step of one person taking that step, and the next step, and the next step, and maybe they hit a wall, and so they find a way around the wall, or they break down that wall, and it can be lonely and scary, as you had said. So yeah, having that support group or people finding like-minded people to help support you, and you supporting them as well, is very, very important. And yeah, in if progress is going to be made. So I love that. So you give workshops and mentoring and in your consultancy. So can you discuss the role of workshops and mentoring consultancy in promoting inclusive and equitable workplaces?
Okay, so I think for me, workshops are really important to get people started in this work and also to reach a broad audience.
Okay.
However, the limitations of workshops is that they don't require a continuous commitment and they don't require people to really practice what they have learned. So I had some people who attended queer inclusion workshops, and after the workshop just said, it's all bullshit, I just let it all go. Like, be aware, like there might be strong resistance that you will not change in a workshop. So there needs to be some sort of accountability structure or change management process after a workshop. But in general, I think if you can put people through workshops, you will reach more people and they may get the basic knowledge. And some of them may apply it automatically, and some of them may need some support to work through their own resistance. In the mentoring processes, I'm saying like they usually take between a year and 2 years, and it's like we meet once a month. And so it usually requires about this time between 12 to 24 months for a person to really integrate the anti-oppressive thinking. And after that, it's quite simple because they know how to apply it. Like a lot of what I say is really that you change your way of thinking and how you view certain things, and then you just apply the principles and it's quite easy for you. And so here's a thing. If people have their own experiences of trauma, some of the anti-oppressive principles may be harder to grasp. So there is a kind of very individual process. So in the end, for me, mentoring is to facilitate the individual change and really provide an in-depth change. And so consultancy is more from the outside, looking at it, getting an assessment, where are people at, where is the organization at, and exploring what might be useful next steps.
So when it comes to an organization wanting to include trauma-informed approaches in their policies and procedures, say a board reaches out to you, do you recommend that they start with, so a few board members reach out to you, but they're still kind of skeptical. Do you recommend that they start with mentoring first, going through that process, and then incorporate, and maybe at the same time incorporating workshops in the organization, and then consultancy? Or can they do all three at the same time?
I would say it depends on which stage they're in. So for this change process, people are different changes. So the first one is the pre-contemplation phase, where they don't think they have any problems. Then comes a contemplation phase where they have an awareness, oh, maybe we have a problem and maybe we need to do something, but we don't know what. And then comes the action phase where they really start practicing and implementing. And then it's a maintenance phase where they just live what they want to do. So if the board members are in pre-contemplation and contemplation, I would say, let's start with the board members, do mentoring, because if they don't understand it, it won't go anywhere meaningful.
Yeah.
Because they need to understand it and they need to understand what problem they have. And then afterwards, really creating a plan on where's the organization at, and also deciding where does the organization want to go for. Because I often say to the organizations I'm part of, like, if it's not part of your strategic plan, it won't go anywhere. Like, you need to really integrate it, structure it. And so I think I see mentoring useful for leaders who need more support and who may have not yet the awareness. And then we can put in the other elements, because the workshops with employees are useless if the leader have no awareness around it, because they can't hold them accountable. And so it's a bit like, start with those who have the most power, because they have the decision-making power. If they don't understand it, I don't think there is a meaningful change possible. And be aware it's a change management process. So people need to get trained into it and understand it. And you need to define what is your goal in it. And you probably after a while need to check in, where are you at? what has worked, what has not worked, and where you need to realign. And the other thing is what I'm saying, if organizations are committed to fully implement it, in the end, at one stage, you will need to decide whether maybe you need to let go of some of your employees. Like, you cannot do a change management process and have everybody on board, because some of your employees will not do the change.
Yep, that is true. They will be resistant up until the end.
Yes, and so this is a bit like, you need to find out how much effort do you want to put in, when do you say no?
I agree. So yeah, the reason why I asked that question, because as you were explaining each of the 3 types, workshops, mentoring, and consultancy, it made sense. And you confirmed it, that if there's, that the leaders should start with the mentorship first, because they need to be able to fully understand it and walk the walk and role model these practices in the organization. Because if the leaders aren't doing it, the chances of anybody else in the organization of following the trauma-informed approaches and practices significantly decreases. And it's so, yeah. So I love that it starts with mentoring. And I wish more consultants did mentoring, because it is very, very effective and important, because, as you said, like, even if it's like a DEI consultant or a health and wellness consultant, whatever the consultant's niche is, it's always good to start with mentoring, I think, or have a mentoring component, because it's not only reinforces what you're doing with your client, but it helps them gain awareness and increase their understanding in what they're being taught and shown. And so I love that.
Like, I think for me, mentoring is a bit also the practical part of it. Like, you can say a lot of things, but if people in practice don't know what it means, you cannot apply it. Like,
yeah, that's true. That is true. Because just like the workshops, as you said, people go to the workshops all the time. And for many, it's in one ear, out the other. It's just something. It took up 3 hours of their day, and it was like, and half the time, people aren't always fully paying attention in the workshops. They're on their phones. If it's not an interactive workshop, or if it's not, if the leadership is not in attendance, or if the leadership has not expressed how important this is, and that they've gone to these workshops, and they've gained so much value from them. So it all stems from the leaders. They need to be the role models, and in order for them to do that, they need to fully understand what it is these initiatives are, and how they can be put into practice.
Yes, I agree.
So is there anything else that you'd like to tell our listeners today before we get to the key takeaways? No,
right now I feel like I've said everything that was in my mind. I draw a blank.
It was a great conversation.
Okay, maybe the one thing I can say, be aware today's conversation was like one small seed out of something really big. So it is I find it a really beautiful practice. I find it one way on how we can create a healthy society. And I'm also aware, for me, I put in a lot of work to get there. So be aware, like, it's a continuous process. And so today is just a small seed for many steps to follow.
I love it. And it's important to say, thank you for saying that, because as we had mentioned before, trauma is very complex. And so thank you so much. So listeners, let's go to some key takeaways. So Natalie and I talked about understanding gender diversity. We gained a comprehensive understanding of gender diversity and the importance of inclusive practices in the workplace. We talked about trauma-informed approaches. We learned how trauma-informed practices can support gender diverse individuals in their healing journey. We talked about anti-oppressive practices and explored how anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices can create a safer and more inclusive environment for everyone. We talked about leadership strategies and discovered effective strategies for leaders to address power and privilege and promote inclusivity within their teams. And Natalie talked about her personal experience, Natalie talked about their personal experiences and professional insights on overcoming challenges and fostering inclusion. Any other key takeaways, Natalie?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay, cool. So some possible next steps for listeners. So this is your call to action. I always end with a call to action. Remember, educate yourself. Learn more about gender diversity, trauma-informed practices, because it's, as I said, as Natalie and I said, it's very huge topic, and anti-oppressive frameworks. Implement inclusive practices. Apply the strategies discussed in this episode and create a more inclusive workplace. Seek professional guidance. Consider engaging with professionals like Natalie for workshops, mentoring, and consultancy services. And promote dialogue. Foster open and respectful conversations about gender diversity and inclusion within your organization, educational institution, and community at large. Any other possible next steps for listeners, Natalie, that you'd like to mention?
No, they sound
all right.
Very profound.
Awesome, cool. And Natalie, if any of our listeners want to get in touch with you, whether it's to have you come speak on, at an event or an engagement or on a podcast, or if they want to solicit your services or learn more about your services, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, they can get in touch with me via email at nat@brighthorizontherapies.com. And otherwise, they can also book online a free discovery session, and we can just have a conversation if they prefer this personal contact. Yeah.
Okay. And what's your website where they can go and
my website is brighthorizontherapies.com.
brighthorizontherapies.com. All right. Listeners, I will be putting Natalie's contact information on one of the last slides of our podcast, as well as in their contact information is in the description of our podcast today. So if you want to reach out to Natalie, which I highly recommend because trauma-informed approaches and practices are extremely important to recognize and implement in organizations, feel free to go to the description of our podcast to find their contact information. So Natalie, thank you so much for being our guest today. I really love this conversation. You are very knowledgeable, and this was it was an eye-opening conversation for me. I learned a lot from you, and I hope my listeners did too. And thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you, Andrea, for having me. I really appreciated our conversation.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. So listeners, with that, I'm going to let you go. Remember, our podcast episodes are launched every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's New York time. So check out our next episode this coming Thursday. Remember, stay diversifused. I'll talk to you later. Bye. Be a guest speaker on the Get Diversifuse podcast, I'm on the lookout for guests. So if you're passionate about DEI and would like to share your unique insights, experiences, or success stories, I want to hear from you. If you're a fellow podcaster who's passionate about DEI, let's swap the mic and amplify each other's voices. If you're interested in being a guest, reach out to me at Andrea@diversifuse.com and I'll send you the link to our guest interest form. Hope to hear from you soon. Remember, stay diversifused. Now go out there and make a difference. And as always, for more strategies on building inclusive workplaces and communities, check out Diversifuse. We're here to guide you on your DEI journey. Make sure to visit our website at diversifuse.com and follow us on social media for the latest happenings, blog posts, tips, and events.